Description. All right. So welcome everyone to this SoConnect data session. My name is Michael Alkema, and today I'll be your host for this evening. We're going to talk about Microsoft Purview. And Microsoft Purview is the tool in Azure to manage the governance of the data estate in Azure. It allows for automatic discovery of your data products, and it classifies data based on predefined or custom rules. In this session, Erik is going to talk about interesting features about Purview, like Purview's metadata model, how to create managed and self-service data projects, creating and maintaining access workflows, and lastly, there's also going to be a demo about Purview's REST API. So that's going to be really interesting. Before we get started, a couple of notes. First of all, please mute your microphones. It's okay to leave your webcam on. That's not an issue. Furthermore, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I will get quickly to them. And lastly, this session is being recorded. So in the end, I will share a link with the recordings and all the other relevant things as well. And yes, I think that's it. So Erik, please go ahead and have a great presentation.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Welcome everybody to this session. In this session, I really want to give you a high-level overview of Purview, but also deep dive into the different features of Purview. And I'm going to focus on the data governance part, because as you will see later on that Microsoft Purview has two different portals you can manage, compliance portal and the data governance portal. But first of all, I want to introduce myself a bit. I'm Erik. I'm a lead BI and analytics architect at Sogeti, and I'm working in Azure for almost 8 years now. So a quick look at the agenda. The goals for these sessions are, first of all, to have a one-on-one overview of what is Microsoft Purview. Maybe a lot of you already know what Purview is, but maybe also some in this call don't know what Purview is, so it's good to have a quick overview. Second, I will go deeper into the main components of Azure Data Governance using Purview, and that's the Azure resource you use with the Purview portal. And I'm going to do some deep dives into the different components of the data governance with some hands-on demos. And last but not least, I will also demo the Purview Atlas API, and that's based on a REST API. So data management with Purview, how does it fit? If you look at the DAMA or the data management book of knowledge wheel, then you can distinguish some sections in the wheel, and in the middle you see data governance. And as you might expect from the title of this session, we're only going to cover the middle part, but that's not the case. Purview doesn't cover the full DAMA wheel, but there are some sections in this wheel that we will also cover. For example, if you look at data security management, that's partly covered also in Purview. If you look at master data management, Purview has partnered with Prophecy. So master data management is not a component in Purview itself. So if you want to do master data management with Purview, you need to have a Prophecy subscription, and that's a SaaS solution which integrates nicely with Purview. But Purview does do a lot of metadata management, which you will also see in some hands-on demos later on. And of course, the data governance is a very important part, but also a little bit of data quality management. It's not a data quality tool. Let me emphasize that, but there is some data quality management capabilities in Purview. Okay, I already mentioned that there are 2 Purview portals. And you might say, what the heck? Why do we have 2 Purview portals? Well, one portal is the old Office or Microsoft 365 compliance portal, and that's more tailored for SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, Outlook. And the other portal is the Microsoft Purview Governance Portal or Data Governance Portal in Azure. And that's more to govern your data sources in Azure itself or data sources outside Azure, but that's really data oriented. And if you look at the different portals, this is the Purview portal in Azure. And this is the compliance portal. And this is not the full portal because this is based on our corporate portal, and I'm not a compliance admin. So yeah, this is partly of the functionality, but here you can see, for example, that you can do privacy risk management, insider risk management. It's very much tailored to compliance management. My focus for tonight is purely the data governance portal in Azure. So that's good to make that distinction. Go back to the presentation. Okay. So if you look at the compliance portal, you see also information protection. And information protection also plays an important part in the data governance portal. Like I said, the data governance portal resides in Azure, and the compliance portal in Microsoft 365. So that's the main difference. Microsoft has rebranded Azure Purview and the compliance portal to Microsoft Purview, so to have one single name. Okay, if you look at the different portals, there is some overlap or some integration, and that's mainly in the information protection part, and that's the sensitivity labels. So that's the sensitivity of your data. Is it confidential? Is it public data? Is it organizational data? Does it have IP, so intellectual property protected data? Then you can define these labels in information protection in the compliance portal, and you can use them in the governance portal. The governance portal is mostly used with Azure resources like SQL Database, Synapse, Data Factory, machine learning, and also Power BI. But it can also discover data sources from AWS, for example, an S3 bucket, SAP, Google, Oracle, and Snowflake. But there are many more data connectors in Purview. So the data governance part is completely in Azure. But Microsoft has also announced Microsoft Fabric, and it's not yet clear what will be in Fabric in regards to data governance. My expectation will be that the whole Purview data governance portal will also be moved to Data Fabric, but there are some private preview features already in Fabric for data governance, but it's not fully integrated yet. Okay, Microsoft Fabric. The portal for Microsoft Fabric is mainly the Power BI portal, as you can see here. And there's some rebranding done in Fabric, like the one-layer Data Hub. In Power BI, it was called the Data Hub. And here you see some preview features like govern, secure, and manage your entire data estate. So that gives away some of your features you have in Purview, that it's also available in preview in the Fabric portal. So you can see here the sensitivity labels from information protection, so and the data loss prevention. So there is some functionality in Fabric already available. Okay, what is the architecture of Purview? Well, this is the most shown architecture of Purview, and Purview mostly discovers the data sets, puts it in a data catalog after discovery. But to be able to discover it, you have to create your data map. So you have to create your collections and register data sources, like, for example, Synapse or SQL Server or Power BI, to that collections. And how that's done, I will show you later. But if you have this data map, you can use it to catalog the data, to share data inside or outside the organization. And that's on the producer and consumer sides. And for the data officers, data stewards, you get data state insights. So you can see what is the catalog adoption, how is the data doing, the compliance of the data, and you can manage the data policies. Well, here you can see that not everything is generally available yet. So data sharing and data policy is still in preview. Not all parts of the data policies, which you will see later, but some of them are still in preview. Okay, so how does the metadata model look in preview itself? I created this overview to show the different entities, or how you say that, different sections in Purview and how these relate to each other. So you have a Purview account, and Purview is really meant as a centralized tool to manage your data. And in the Purview account, you have to deploy that to Azure, and that's a pretty straightforward deployment. Then you get the Purview Data Governance portal, which I have shown you before. But if you look at the Azure component, then it's a pretty straightforward component. So this is the Azure Purview component, and there's not much configuration done on this component. The only thing is that you have some managed resources, like a storage account and an event hub. But you can also replace the event hub for the messaging part with a Kafka configuration, but then you have to disable your event hub. You can configure the networking, so you can close the public access connection, so to say, by using, for example, private endpoint connections. You can configure a firewall that Purview can only be accessed by some IPs or some subnets, but not all networks. And you can have ingestion private endpoint connections. And that can help you to secure your whole data estate in Purview. Purview doesn't store your data, it only stores metadata, but even metadata can be confidential. And you can have the managed identities in Purview, and in this case, you only can do user assigned managed identities, and this is also a preview version, so it's not generally available yet to use in production. So this is the Azure resource. This is pretty straightforward. Let me go back to the presentation. So if you have that account, in that Purview account, in this portal, you create collections. And the collection admin is able to create collections, but also assign users to this collection and set certain roles. And if you have a certain role, for example, you have the role of data source administrator, you can register data sources and connect that to these collections. So you can imagine that you can create a HR collection or a finance collection, and then specifically register data sources under certain collections. These data sources are scanned. So you can configure the scans, and these scans have scan rules. And these scan rules determine how the data is discovered and put in the data catalog. These scans run on integration runtimes, and integration runtimes are is a piece of software that runs on a VM, and that is the compute part of Purview. And you have two types of integration runtimes. You have the Azure Purview of the Azure integration runtime. That's always there. It's managed by Microsoft, so you don't have to manage it. And you have self-hosted integration runtimes if you need, for example, to connect to your on-premise data sets. And the scans on the integration runtime discovers the data assets, and these data assets can have a data policy attached, and the data policy can then, for example, be used for self-service data access. These data assets are managed. That means that there is an owner or a data steward or an expert assigned to the data asset, and so he knows everything about that data and can give advice, approve workflows, etc. And he can also get insights if he has the insights role. There are also some asset properties like the owner, expert, but also classification. And the classification is generated based on the classification rules. So that I will show you later also how that works. But also related resources. Purview is based on the Atlas API, and the Atlas API is a graph API which relates the different entities to each other. So, for example, you can say this SQL server processes this data in Data Factory and it writes it to Synapse. So then there are related sources, and that's captured in the API. There's also a glossary. So in the data catalog, you can have one or more glossaries. In the beginning, you could only create one glossary, and in that glossary contains terms, and these terms can be created based on term templates. You can also create your own term templates if you have specific terms for which are used in your organization. You can create your own terms. You can also attach labels to the data assets. For example, the sensitivity labels, like I mentioned before, the confidentiality or the public labeling of your data. And you can create your own attributes. So and that's called managed attributes, also called sometimes custom attributes. But that makes it very flexible to create your own metadata on the data assets. So that was most of the theory I have today. Now I want to really go into the portal and look at the collections, the data map, and the glossary. We will have a look at the data policies. And we will, in the end, I will do a demo using the Purview Atlas API. So if we go into the data catalog, so we go to the Purview portal. If you start the Purview portal from Azure, and you can do that by going into the Azure account, a Purview account, and then open the governance portal, then it will open the Purview portal. But this is the landing page. So here you see which assets you recently have accessed, and you get a sort of predefined functions, links like browse assets, manage glossary, and knowledge center. But you can also search the catalog, and this is really free text search. So it will search all your data assets you have discovered, but also glossary terms, etc. So next, as part of the data catalog hub, you see a browse, and with the browse function, you can browse all the assets. You can do that by collection or by source type. And you see here that I have 5 asset types or source types discovered or registered. And you can then select, okay, I have some data lake accounts, which data lake accounts are registered within this data catalog. And there's a new feature called business assets, and this gets really interesting if you want to have your functional or business lineage connected to your technical lineage. That means that you relate your business processes and resources to your technical or IT processes and resources. For example, you have an HR process and you have an HR database. You can connect that HR process or application to that discovered HR database in Purview. But like I said, this is in preview stage, so it's not really fully functional yet. But I expect this will be extended quite a lot in the coming time. And this is the glossary. Like I said before, you can create terms. And here, for example, I have 4 sample terms. You can create new terms very easily. You can create term templates for this or use the system default. And system defaults only has some basic fields. But you can also create a full hierarchy of your terms. So for example, if you have different types of businesses in your organization, you can create for a specific line of business, you can create a term, a root term collection, and then create the terms under that. But yeah, that's how you want to create or set up your hierarchy yourself. You can also import terms from an Excel sheet, for example, and you can assign context to your terms. You see that the status of these terms are all in draft. So that means if someone wants to change a term or add a new term, a workflow is executed, and then the glossary administrator has to approve this workflow. So for example, I created a new term, and I have a workflow for this. Create a workflow, for example, update glossary term. And that's a predefined workflow you can select from the templates. And it only says, okay, when a term update request is submitted, it waits for an approval. If I click on it, in this case, everyone must approve, but yeah, there's only one approval, and that's myself. And then it will be approved. Yes, then the glossary term will be updated. If no, then you get an email that the request is rejected. So this is a very nice way to manage your glossary. And if you look at the requests and approvals, you see that I'm also the glossary administrator, so I have a pending request, in this case for myself, and I can choose response. I can reject it or approve it. And if I approve it, the workflow will automatically approve the glossary term update. And if it's working, you see that I approved this term. So now one is from draft to approved. So everyone can use this term now and see, okay, this is a valid term for my organization. So those are the functions of the data catalog. The next I want to show you is the data map. And the data map is quite extensive. And the data map, this is where all the actions happen when you have to register your data sources or manage your collections. And the collections, this is really where you manage your hierarchy of your organization and where you register your data sources. But also in this collections part, you manage all your permissions and your roles inside of Purview. You see here, for example, collection admins. A collection admin can manage collections and assign roles, but cannot do anything else than that. So it's not a data curator. It's not a data reader, so it cannot do anything on the data side or policy side unless you really assign someone to this role. And you see there are quite some roles built in Purview. And these are all managed within the Purview portal and not in Azure. So the previous version of Purview, the roles were managed in Azure, but these have been deprecated. So you can create a hierarchy. For example, I create a geographical hierarchy and a global HR department, for example. But also I created a sales department in Europe. And here you can also see the data sources. So you see the assets, you see the data sources. I have one data source attached, and that's an Azure SQL database. And in that SQL database, these assets are discovered, and that can be tables, SQL tables, that can be schemas like the DB owner. It can be a view, it can be everything. But you also see that I have a department attached. Hey, that's strange. This is not nothing to do with SQL database, but this is one of these business objects that you can create in the data catalog in the business assets section. So this is the HR department. So if you look at the HR department, you can see here, for example, contacts. You can assign experts, owners, or stewards, and you can see if applicable, there's also some related business process, but I don't have any business processes or business assets related to this department yet. So if you look at the data source section, here you can see all the data sources. It can be in a table view, it can also be in a map view, and then you see the whole map of your organization. This is the root collection that's always there from the deployment. But here you can see the different collections I created, plus the sales department collection, and under that I registered the SQL database. I also registered Azure Data Lake storage, and what you can see is that I connected that to the root collection. You can only register a data lake once. So in this case, a root collection would be the most appropriate. We are still waiting for a preview where you can register different data lake containers, because that would be very nice. Such a data source needs to be scanned. So you can create a new scan. In this case, it will run on the auto-resolve integration runtime. That's the Azure integration runtime, but not the self-hosted. It will use the system-assigned identity of Purview, and it will run under the root collection. You can do a test connection if you like. You can continue if the test is successful, and then you can say, okay, what do I want to scan? Maybe you don't want to scan all the containers on the data lake, just a few containers, or I want to scan everything. So yeah, in this case, I want to scan everything, and then I can select a rule set. Like I said before, you can have rule sets on your scan. In this case, it's a system default. That's the ADLS Gen 2 rule set, the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. That's provided by Microsoft. And you can also create your own rule set. And a rule set says what objects can I discover in the data lake. And if I click continue, I can say it's a recurring scan, or I just want to scan it once. And then I can save the scan and run it. And then it will go over my data lake and scan all the data assets that are in this data lake. So if you have this set up right, then you can also monitor it. You can monitor the scans. You can see if they are succeeded or failed. Maybe some are cancelled. So you have a nice overview of all your scans. You can also see the details. And you see that the scan I just kicked off is still in progress. And you can also see that there's no failed scans yet, but you can also see here the data source name. This is a pretty basic monitoring feature, but it gives a nice overview if you have a lot of scans running, what the status is of the scans. In the data catalog, you already saw the business assets in a list or in a hierarchy. If you look at the data map, you can create a meta model. And the meta model is used by Purview to connect the assets to each other based on the meta model. So if you create a meta model, for example, you have an application service which has a system, consists of a system, and it has a database connected to that system. If you create a system, for example, a payroll system, and it has an HR database or a payroll database, then Purview will automatically create these relationships. And here you can see the relationships, and you can add your own relationships. So this is pretty flexible to create a full meta model of your business. So these are not the data assets. That needs to be pretty clear, because this is just the meta model of your business. But you can create, for example, a data pipeline. For example, if you have a database and there's a data pipeline that fills the database from a different data source, then you can add that as a meta model item. Okay, so that's the asset types, and you see various types like business, data, governance, but governance is still empty. And for example, departments, lines of business, organization. And so you can create a full data map or full map of your data estate in your organization. So that's very nice to have, but it's still in preview. Next is the data classifications. And the data classifications says everything about your data and the columns, so the metadata of your data. So is it a driver license? Is it a BSN number or whatever? How is it used to discover the classification of your data? And that's based on certain patterns. And these are all built in, given by Microsoft already. You can see that also on the formal name, Microsoft Government Netherlands BSN number. And these classifications are used to discover your data. You can also create classification rules. These are the built-in rules, as you can see, but you can also create your own classification rules. For example, I created a simple classification rule to discover a payroll number. And I know a payroll number is starting with a P, and it has 8 digits. That's the regular expression to create the data pattern for the discovery of the data which contains payroll numbers. Because if Purview scans, it scans a lot of data. It doesn't know what data it is, but based on these patterns, it can say, okay, I've now found a column with a payroll number in it. And that helps to classify your data. I also said that it's possible to create your own managed attributes. And these are the custom attributes you can create to classify your data based on, for example, a specific asset type. In this case, I can create a specific attribute which also always applies to a SQL database, give it a description, and put it in an attribute group. In this case, it's an HR group. Next to that, you have data shares. And data shares really is to share inside or outside your organization your data in a secure manner. You can create a new share. For example, I have a public holidays CSV file on the data lake, and I shared it. In this case, I created it, and I can easily share that. If you look at the definition of this share, you have to create a share name, then you define the location where this file is can be found, and then you can share it. You have send shares, so I can send a share to someone. But if I'm a user of the Purview portal, I can also see my receive share. So if someone creates a share for me, then I can see that here. And here you can also create your shared. You see your shared sources in an overview. How many send shares are created and how many receive shares. In this case, these are 2 data lakes. And here you can see your invites. So I have 2 invites running at the moment to connect to this data. What you also can see for the source management are the scan rules sets. And these are the scan rules that are executed on the integration runtime when the data is scanned. The scan engine has to know what type of resource it's scanning. For example, the SQL Data Warehouse or a Synapse SQL pool or a SQL Server or a data lake. So these scan rules are regularly updated. As you can see, we're now on version 5. So if you click on update, it will automatically update your scan rules. You can also create your own custom scan rules. For example, if you have a specific data lake which can only contain specific type of files, you can create a custom rule, and you can say, okay, I want only CSV files discovered, and it can only apply to these classification rules. So that, and you can say, okay, some patterns can be ignored. Some specific files I don't want to see in the classification. So that helps to tailor your scanning. And you can also have pattern rules. And the pattern rules can be used, for example, if you have a lot of files in data lake and you want to combine that in a resource group, and it's not an Azure resource group, but a group of data assets with a specific theme, like, for example, all HR files or all sales files. You can use these pattern rules to group that automatically. So that helps to identify your data more easily. And these are the integration runtimes. So in this case, I only have the built-in integration runtime, the Azure integration runtime, and it's put in a managed virtual network. That means this is a data exfiltration protection mechanism. It runs in a VNet at Microsoft. So you can't exfiltrate your data easily. So that's the data map. If you look at the data estate insights, that's really the insights part, then you can see what are my users, my Purview users doing with my catalog or with my assets. What is the state of the assets? Are they fully curated or are they not curated at all? In this case, they're not curated at all. So there's some attention needed by the data owners. Have all assets the data owner assigned? Or do they have classifications, sensitive classifications? So you can see that you can do a lot in the insights part. Mind you, this is not real time. This is not even once per day. As you can see, my last report generated here was April 26. It's really currently not very often updated. So that's one of the drawbacks of this part. If you look at the catalog adoption, that shows how the users are using Purview, how many searches are done, how many active users do you have on a monthly basis or on a daily basis, per category, or maybe even per asset. What are the most viewed assets? You can also see if someone searched the catalog on a specific keyword, then you can see what keywords are mostly searched for. In this case, it's not showing. I did do some searches, but it's not showing, so it's not yet fully functional. But you can also have a look into your assets. So, for example, your data lakes, or you can see your data assets by source type. You can see the SQL database, storage, data lake storage, Azure table storage, blob, Azure files. This comes from the Azure storage account, but also Azure Data Factory if you have connected that. The business asset types, organizational asset types, but also here you can see the Azure dedicated SQL pool. So that this is all based on types. It's unfortunately not clickable, but you can view the details and then you can see them. So you have to really click on the details and then you can see what types are used, and also what assets are connected to that specific asset type. If I go click on that asset, I straightly go into the data catalog again, and here you can see all the different categories, like, for example, a table. If I filter out the SQL tables, then you can see only the SQL tables, because this is a SQL database asset. So there are the data estate assets. You can also curate and govern the glossary. So how many terms are still in draft, or maybe some are expired, because you can set an expiry date on your glossary term. But you can also see, do I have terms without assets connected? Do I have term with assets? Well, since this is not updated recently, I have terms without assets, but it doesn't show yet. But also if you have incomplete terms, so if there are no experts or stewards attached to that, because who is then who owns the term? That's not very practical if you don't have a data steward or owner assigned to a term, because then your glossary gets a bit well, not well maintained to the least. Okay, so also with the classifications, you can see the classification insights. And here are the sensitivity labels, which I mentioned before, which are coming from information protection from the compliance portal. So if you have labels assigned to your data assets, you would see them here. I currently don't work with the sensitivity labels because I don't have access to the sensitivity labels section in the Purview portal. But if you would have them, then you would see the assets discovered with sensitivity labels in here. And that will get me to the next section. So this is the data map. You can register your data sources on the data map. And the next deep dive, I want to go into the data access policies. And within Purview, there are three types of policies. You have data owner policies. Those are mostly created by curators, data curators, or data owners. As you can see, it's still in preview. And it's made of policy statements, and a policy statement trigger some sort of action, and it's mostly used for access to Azure resources like SQL database or data lake. And it looks like this. You can have an allow action that give read permissions on a specific data resource to these subjects, and a subject can be an AD security group or a user. The second type of policies are the DevOps policies. These, strangely enough, are generally available. These came later than the data owner policies and the self-service data access policy, but these are generally available. And this gives certain DevOps roles, this is how Microsoft calls them, access to SQL, for example, without the need to access the data. For example, if you have a security auditor, you can give a DevOps role security auditor to the security auditor role. Then you can see all the security data of the metadata in the SQL database, but not the data itself. Same with the performance monitor. If you have a DBA, which is not allowed to access sensitive data, you can say, okay, he has no access to data, but he can completely monitor the performance, so the extended events in SQL Server of the database. This is helpful because this really can disconnect your IT personnel from the data, which some of the organizations really require. Then you have the self-service data access policy. This is also in preview. And this is with this, a user can request data access to a specific asset. It's not all assets are supported yet. It's still in preview, so it's still under construction, but it's a nice feature to create more self-service in your organization. It uses a workflow under the hood to grant, like same as the Glossary workflow, to grant the access to a specific user, and the data owner or the data steward can then approve or reject the access. It only works with the registered resources, so you have to register your resources in the Datamap. This is the next demo, so let's go to the Purview portal again. So here you have the data policy section. You see the data policies. Here I have a policy created, read-only access on the sales database. And here you can see it allows read access on the sales schema in the SQL database. And here you can see the SQL server and the SQL database and the schema to the principal data source admin. And this is an AD user, so Azure Active Directory user. And then Purview under the hood will grant access to this user in the SQL database itself without creating a user. It's just a policy. And it took me a bit of research to find out how Purview is doing that under the hood. Because if you look at the database and you go to the users, and I have a user, I'm looking up the user data source admin, I can't find it. But the way that Purview is doing that is it creates a sys table, and in the sys table it creates a record, and in this case I have a read access allowed. So in this case, this principal object AD, and that's a GUID of the user in Azure Active Directory, is allowed read access to the database. So it gets the Purview data role built-in read. So it's really managed inside the database itself without creating new logins or users. So that's it's pretty it's pretty hard to find. But if you know which dynamic management view you need to query, then you can see that. And these are the queries you can use for these specific policies. So the policy actions, the roles connected to the actions, the principals, the role members, and the policy principals which are assigned to the actions. So which users or which AD security groups are assigned to the actions. So that's very nice because you don't have to manage any users in your database. So that helps a lot with your self-service access control. Okay, so if I look at the data source admin, I can access that complete database because that's I was granted access. So if I would delete that policy, I would as a data source admin user, I would not have access to this database anymore. But for the sake of time, I want to continue with the next, and that's the self-service access policy. And you can see it's a preview. And to be able to use this self-service access, you can see there's no action here. There's you can do nothing, only refresh or delete a self-service access policy. But to be able to use the self-service access policy, you need to create a workflow. And this workflow is really a built-in workflow. So if you say new workflow, you can select governance. So set up a workflow for data policy and access governance. Say continue, and you see data access request. This is the only template currently available in Purview. So this is still preview, very limited. And then I can say, okay, data access request. And here you can set some parameters. For example, if a request comes in, then the request needs to go to my mail address, my user account, and then there's one more parameter I need to fill in. Let me see which it is. Task and completion. This one was okay. This one. And then I have to say, okay, if someone creates that request, you can also add dynamic content. You can say, okay, I put in the workflow requester, and the mail address of the user account is then used to set new or to send notifications, for example. I can save and close it. And before I can save and close it, I have to apply it. So I apply it, for example, to the Europe sales collection. These are the collections. I say, okay, save and close. So now I have a workflow. So if I go to my sales database and I go to browse, I go to sales, and I select, for example, the database, you would normally see a request access activated. It was grayed out before, but now it's activated. So now I can request access. I say, okay, I like access. And now it will use that workflow under the hood to create that data access request. And if I go to management, requests and approvals, and you see here the data access request, which I can approve or reject, because I'm also a curator, so I can, and a data policy manager, so I can approve or reject this request. So that without the need to go to Azure Active Directory or create AD security groups, you can manage your access to your data assets from this portal. So that's very nice. So then in this way, you can decouple your data governance from your infrastructure governance. So your access to the resources in Azure itself. And here you can also see the workflow runs. So here's the data access request, it's completed. So, and it's submitted a minute ago. So that's a nice feature. Here you see the DevOps policies I mentioned before. And here you can also see the different types of access. So the security auditing that only gives you access to the metadata, security data audit logging of the SQL Server in this case, or the performance monitoring. And then you will only get access to the performance data of the SQL database. So to troubleshoot performance or long-running queries or that kind of stuff. And that's only currently on the SQL database, and you can do it on Azure subscription level, resource level, Arc-enabled SQL Server. So if you have an on-prem SQL Server running on Azure Arc, you can also use that. But yeah, the most applicable use case would be a SQL Server. The last section I want to cover is the management section. And that gives an overview of the account information. So this is the friendly name of the Purview account, and the Purview account is that account that is deployed in Azure. That's called a Purview account, as you can see here. And you can enable some advanced resource sets so that you can more customization on your resources. And this is the Insights refresh, the data insights section, and you can schedule that. But like I said, that's a very, it's not really accurate. Sometimes it refreshes in a week, sometimes it doesn't refresh at all. So this data insights is still, work in progress, as I say. But you can also see some metrics, but in this case, the metrics you have to look up in the Azure Monitor because it's not in this portal. Microsoft is very keen lately to centralize monitoring, security, compliance. So to put the metrics into the application, that's not the way forward for Microsoft. So for that, you have to use Azure Monitor. There are two integration options, and that are Data Factory. So you can integrate your Data Factory. In this case, I have a Data Factory from my previous session I did on Purview, where I also showed the lineage extracted from the Data Factory data pipelines. And you can create data shares based on Azure Data Share. Don't have any data shares set up, but currently it's these are the only two integrations you have. This one we already saw. That's the preview functionality to create workflows. Very limited at the moment, but it's very promising because it really helps to automate your whole data governance. And this is where the requests and approvals come in. So my pending request, my waiting for response, the history. So I canceled a couple of requests. I approved a couple of requests. And the workflow runs. So that's what we saw. In the security and access, you can create your credentials. For example, I put in my SQL authentication credentials in Purview, which is a best practice, secure by design. Put your credentials in Key Vault. So in this case, in the Key Vault for Purview. And I can use that to register my data source based on these credentials. And that helps me to keep my credentials safe. So I don't have to put any passwords in this credential. And you will also see that if I edit, then you can see I only have to reference a secret name, and that's the secret name in the Key Vault. And if you use versioning in Key Vault, also the secret version. So this helps to keep Purview very secure. And these are the managed private endpoints. So if you have a policy that public endpoints are not allowed, and you can only use private endpoints, so your own private network, then you can create managed private endpoints in this section. Sometimes they are automatically created if you create a specific resource, and sometimes you have to create them manually. In this case, I have 2 managed private endpoints, but these are for the blob storage that are supporting Purview under the hood. And in this case, also to the Purview account. So these are all the functionality in the Purview portal. Michael, are there any questions in the chat? Maybe we can do some questions in between.
Yeah, so far there aren't any questions.
I have a lot. I can put them in the chat.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, they're coming.
So Marshall, you can go ahead if you have any questions. You don't have to put them
just
in the
chat. Just in the chat for now, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I would say start.
Oh wow.
Okay, so is Purview a Microsoft products or about one? Microsoft knowing they're always buy products integrated in an easy way, like master data and data quality.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at Purview and compare it to the enterprise data catalog from Informatica, how does it compare? Is there a big difference, or is it really a kind of a step-in tool, or?
I don't want to say that. Well, Purview is not completely enterprise ready, as you have seen. The many things still in preview or just have just limited functionality. But I think it's a good way to integrate your Azure resources and have a full discovery of your data estate in Azure. But also if you have Amazon or Salesforce or whatever, there are a lot of data connectors in Purview. But it's very hard to compare it to Informatica Data Catalog or Collibra, because I think these products are just a bit ahead of Microsoft. But Microsoft is also the evolution of Purview is very high at the moment. If you look at the different new releases and features that are released, that's very high. But I can also imagine that Microsoft is now focusing very much on Fabric. So a lot of the data governance and compliance will also be put in Fabric. So I don't know how much effort Microsoft will put in Purview in the coming year, or that the focus will shift to Fabric.
But probably we can ask Rainier to answer. I think he was experiencing the Informatica Enterprise Data Catalog, right, Rainier?
Yeah, I just implemented it at NS, so...
Not a big answer, but just at a high level, how does Purview look like compared to your experience with Informatica?
Well, it's basically like Eric said, Informatica is a bit further along on this kind of product. I was actually pleasantly surprised to see the new things coming to Purview. I mean, conceptually, they are a lot like the Informatica tooling. So, okay, there's a lot of things in preview, so they are still working on it. But I can see a lot of things that are actually comparable to the Informatica cloud solution. And yeah, well, I'm a bit curious about how it will develop with Microsoft, because I also think they will probably focus some more on the Fabric first. But definitely on the conceptual stage, Purview is looking more and more comparable to the Informatica tooling.
Yeah, that's my D2. Despite of that, I don't have a hands-on experience, but just on demo basis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Purview started out as a very technical tool, so basically mostly the Azure assets, but now they are also working a lot on the business part, right? So that you can map your whole business processes, applications in this tool. and
Yeah,
then
indeed, and
connect
that was,
the technical assets to your functional lineage, to your business assets.
yeah, that was also a question for me. I saw in your demo that you created or you showed data and organizational objects. But you can create your own ones like business process, ETL process, reports, systems, that kind of IT objects. Yeah, you can do it yourself.
Partly. There is some, yeah, like I said, there are some limitations still in Purview, but there is some link to Power BI. Yeah? For example, I don't know exactly where it was, but you can have a connection to Power BI that you can use Power BI to manage your Purview, but I don't know if it's
but that's using Power BI to report on the metadata.
Yeah.
But it's more
But
that you have connections to Power BI, for instance, in which report are defined and what are the authorizations on that and which objects they use, that kind of stuff. More the technical structure of an IT product.
Yeah.
Okay. So next release, I think that's the basic answer.
Yeah, it's still they started as a minimum viable product when they first started, and they replaced the original Azure Data Catalog, which was very low in functionality, and well, hardly anyone adopted that catalog. Then they came with Purview, and Purview is really that's where Microsoft puts all her eggs in one basket for data governance.
Yeah, I understand.
Especially,
I'm happy with the steps they make, of course.
Yeah.
And another question that I had is, you showed the meta modeling, very nice. When you start with implementing Purview from scratch, do you have to start with your meta model, or is there something like a template, a basic template that you can use and extend, or?
No, the business assets, or in the Datamap, the asset types. This is still in Purview, but this is what you get out of the box.
Okay.
So there's not really a template, but this is your starting point, and then you can create new assets. You can, for example, say create an asset, and it's the sales department. So I can create an asset and select you can create glossary terms or connect glossary terms to that asset. And you can say, okay, the context, but you can also say related. So
nice.
What type of relationships do I want this asset have? And these relationships are drawn from the meta model. I cannot edit it. But if I connect a term to a application service, in this case, you automatically get this relationship based on your meta model. But you can create as many assets or asset types, as it's called, as you like. You can also import it. So you can create a CSV file with all your departments or all your business processes. For example, if you draw that extract it from your CMDB, or your configuration management database, and then you can import it in Purview. So that's a nice feature they added recently.
Okay. Yeah. You said that your Purview does not contain the actual data itself.
No.
But it does in fact scan.
Yeah.
Okay, that's correct. But why does he do a scan?
To discover the data, and not to have to import all your data, because if you do a repeatable scan, a scheduled scan, and it has to import the data every time, then the scans will be very slow. But there's also a risk. You don't want to have all your data in Purview.
Why does he do a scan? Where does he need it for?
How does it otherwise connect or classify the data? Because by doing these scans and using these scan rule sets, you can classify your data.
Yeah, okay. This the kind of the more the quality part of the data. Is it, does it satisfy patterns, that kind of stuff?
Based on the patterns, it will discover it as a BSN number or a credit card number. And then it can automatically label these as confidential, for example.
Oh, okay.
So it's very useful.
I think.
Yeah, it's very useful to have a complete overview of your confidentiality in your data sets or your personal sensitive data. So GDPR data, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how much of experience you already have, but the architecture and the way of using it looks very easy. But what's your opinion on starting implementation, your adoption with the tool? Is it easy? Is it really that easy?
To be frank, I'm not very experienced on a functional level. I'm more a technical Azure architect. But I found it pretty easy. The only things what was a bit confusing for me were the data policies. Because why do we have 3 types of policies? That's why I created a slide for it to make sure that the distinction between these policies are known. And also, when you look at the asset types, I had a bit of a hard time to find where I can connect the physical assets. So, for example, SQL table to, for example, this asset type database.
Okay.
Because I was looking, it's not here. It's not here. I can add a relationship, but I cannot add an asset. Where should I find it? And it turned out that I need to do it at the asset itself. So that was a bit of not because here's also create assets. So you think, okay, then I can create a database. Yeah, but it's not a database. It's just a placeholder, so to say, for the database. It's a functional asset, not the database itself. So that was a bit hard to find. And also to understand what are classifications, what are classification rules, what's the difference between a classification and a term. But Microsoft has a lot of documentation on it. And what I find, because I created my own meta model based on what I know from Purview, but I couldn't find any meta model in the Microsoft documentation. So that would be very nice if such a model was provided by Microsoft.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
All right, Marcel. I'm really enjoying your questions, but I'm going to quickly check if someone else has questions as well. If they don't, please continue. Again, really enjoying it. But I want to give other people the room to ask questions as well.
Also, I have one demo left, and you don't want to miss that.
Oh, okay.
That's I think that's the biggest advantage of using Purview. It's completely API based, so you can manage it via APIs.
All right. In that case, we have like 15 minutes left. We can quickly do the demo, and if other people have questions, please put them in the chat. Let's do that.
Yeah, the demo is not very long, so we can manage it in time.
Right.
But I think it's good to know what type of APIs you have within Purview, because you have a REST API for data planes. Everything is a REST API, but this is a REST API for data planes, and that's a bit confusing. But this is only for the account operations on the Purview account itself. It can you can manage database data sources, scans and rule sets, but not metadata, not data maps, that kind of stuff. So for that you have a different API, and that's the REST API for collections. Then you can do everything on the collections itself. So giving people access on a specific collection, creating collection, deleting collections, etc. You can create metadata policies. So the data policies, you can create metadata roles, and you have create, update, delete, list, and get permissions on that API. But the demo I want to do is the Atlas API, and the Atlas API is really used to manage everything in Purview, like the data assets, the catalog, manage attributes, glossary, your lineage. You can create your own lineage in Atlas, and it uses the Apache Atlas endpoint. So that's the demo I want to show. If I don't have a this is the data model for the Atlas API. It's based on type definitions, and every type definitions can be, for example, a reference table or an asset, or a process and a data set, and these are all entities. And that's how it's stored in the graph database in Atlas. So if I go to my Postman, with Postman you can fire APIs, and in this case, the first thing what you need to do is create a bearer token. And what I have is an app registration in Azure. You need to create that to be able to access the Purview API. And that app registration, I can have a quick look at that. That app registration is created in Entra or Azure Active Directory. And what you need to do is create API permissions, grant API permissions for that to use the API, and you have to give delegated API access without admin consent to that app registration. And if I register, so generate a token based on that app registration, I get a bearer token, and the bearer token is used to access the API. And this token, I don't know if I have to refresh it because I think it's expired already. But this token is then set as a variable in Postman, and this is the access token I got from my get token generation. And if you have the token, you can do anything you want. For example, get list of connections. And I think it will expire my token. Yes. So I have to generate my token. And if I'm not mistaken, it's already set in the variables section. So it ends on Q4 UA. So I look into the variables. Is this the same token? Nope. Then I have to go to this, copy the token. And for the sake of completeness, I also will change the current value, and then you have to save, or otherwise it's not saved. And now I can use this token. So I can generate a list of collections, and here you get a JSON as a result back with all the collections. So you see here the root collection, you see the Europe collection, and all the information based on that collection. So that's nice. So I can completely automatically, programmatically get all my collections in Purview. Now, if I want to get a list of scans, and it's only posting a URL, right? So only a REST API call. There's nothing much in the headers because this is pre-populated by Postman. The authorization is based on the bearer token, and the only parameter I use is the parameter of the API version. So the body is empty. It's just a URL. So if I send this one, I get an overview of all the scans I did. So in this case, it's scanning the SQL database, and you get all the details of the scans. You can also move your data sources to a different collection, and you can also see the collection moving state. So is it still in the process of moving, or did it completely move? Because that's always handy. And what type of data source you registered in this, or scans, in this case, ADLS. So this is nice to see, to get a programmatically overview of all your scans, but also a list of glossaries. So if I fire this one, you get probably my 2 glossaries. So the first is the default glossary, the built-in glossary with the terms, and you see the test glossary, which I also had in the portal. So this also means that if you can get them, you can also do a post call, and then you can update your glossary. So if you know what you need to post in your body as parameters or as JSON text, then you can create your glossary completely automated. So you can imagine that if a new application comes in and you have a CMDB or a DevOps pipeline, and you have to update your glossary because it's a new term, then you can do that using an API call. This will get all the type defs in, so all the type definitions in Azure, or in Azure in Purview, so in the Atlas API, and you will see this is quite a lot. It will have to it will take some time to get a pretty view of it. There it is. And if I, for example, want to see the Azure SQL database or the Azure SQL server, then it should come up. Then you can see here's the type def for the Azure SQL server. And you see that it's of the category entity. So a data source type in Purview is also called an entity. But also you have relationships, you have glossary terms, you have everything is based in this sort of database of all the metadata. So this is where the types are defined. So it can be SQL Server, it can be Cosmos DB, maybe even S3. Yep, S3. So the AWS S3 buckets, they're also defined here. So this is where all the definitions are for Purview. And then you can create your own types if you want. So in this case, I want to create a new MySQL database type definition. I send a request. Oh, I get the error code because I already created that. So that's nice. But I can also create my SQL DB entity. And the beauty of this is that I create my new data source type, but it should also be visible after a while in Purview as a new data source. So if I go to the Datamap, I don't know if it's visible already, but if it's visible, then you should get here a custom data source section where you can see your data source, but it's not in right now. So yeah, that helps to create your own data sources. So if you have a sort of exotic application with a specific data source which is not discovered as a data source type, then you can add that yourself programmatically. So that's possible, and you can have more demos, but I don't think I have much time left. In this case, a demo is created, entities are created, 2 entities, and the lineage is set in this demo. Don't know if it will work, but let me see. But here you can see there's an entity demo 1, there's an entity demo 2, and then the lineage is set from demo 1 to demo 2, and that's done in this API call. Let me fire it. You cannot find it. But in this API call, the lineage was set and named as custom lineage 01. But this somehow doesn't work now. Can be a timing issue. No, this won't work. But if you have this created, this lineage, then you will see the lineage also in Purview. But unfortunately, it created the references, and this happens sometimes, but it can't find the reference anymore. And that's
All right,
strange.
Erik.
Okay,
I see there's
let's conclude this this session.
I see there's some questions as well. One from Reinier. Would you like to unmute yourself, Reinier, and go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I see that Purview is well, it's developing in a nice way. So I see a lot of comparison also to the Informatica tooling, which I'm very familiar with, of course. So in your demo, you are talking about integrating with all the Microsoft stuff. Well, yeah, sure, that's the first thing they will focus on.
Yep.
So connectivity to Snowflake, for instance, is that also available already? Or?
Yeah, there's you can register data source to Snowflake. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of our customers are looking at Snowflake or implementing it already.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that's one of the bigger sources we want to integrate in the tool like this.
Yeah, the most common sources are Snowflake, SAP for HANA, Postgres, Power BI, because you can also completely see the lineage in Power BI. For example, you use a SQL database in Power BI for a specific report, then the complete lineage is shown in Purview. But also Oracle, HDFS, so Hadoop file systems, Databricks, there are all kinds of connectors in Purview.
Okay.
Synapse. In Synapse, it will also integrate nicely, because then you get a search field in Synapse itself to search for your data. And because if you use a lot of data in Synapse, then it's handy to have a data catalog where you can search to find some data sets. Especially if you use, for example, a data lake with a lot of data, a lot of containers and folders, and Parquet or CSV files, then it's very handy to have a search option.
Yeah, I think that's a nice integration. Yeah. So I also had another question. So I think it's all right to continue to that one. So I'm looking at for NS, for example, they have some very exotic custom created applications. So in the Informatica tooling, we can create a custom model for that. So basically, we create some JSON file in which we can construct certain hierarchies, relationships, all kinds of things specific to that exotic program, to call it like that. So you just mentioned you can also have some customization in Purview, but is that at the same level? So you can even integrate totally exotic systems, or?
Yeah, you can define it in Purview, but there's no specific connector for that. So it's not that you then can connect to the system and get the metadata. You only define your entities via the API, via the type defs, and then you can create your own lineage. And you can then assign terms to it, catalog it, assign the glossary terms to the data assets, but it's not a physical connection to your exotic application, for example. So it's just a definition.
Yeah. So you can. Well, what we said before, Informatica is a bit further ahead with those get features, because there you can create your whole custom connector basically. But I think it's good to see that Purview is also developing a lot in the same way. So conceptually, they are very comparable actually. And,
But technically, if you know the metadata model in Purview, you can create everything that you saw in the demos. You can also create it by the API.
Okay. Well, that were my questions, so thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, great. I will move to the outro now. So let me share my screen. All right. Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Erik for your session. I found it really interesting. So yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, before we quit today, we're going to do a quick outro. So first of all, we have a link here for our feedback. Please let us know what you thought of the session. We would really love to hear that. So like all the links that you're going to see, I will send them at the end of the session in the chat, so no worry. But yeah, please share your thoughts. You can do it through either the link or the QR code. Moving on. Let's see. Let's have a quick look at upcoming sessions. So in the left corner, we can see our current session. That means that the next session is the 3rd of July, and it's our old faithful Power BI quarterly future update. So in this session, we're going to talk about the new features in Power BI. We're going to demo them, discuss them, and these are really interesting for people that work with Power BI. Continuing on the 13th of July, we have our Sustainable Agile Laundrette. And this session goes about, well, most of you would know Agile, and Agile is seen as this very powerful tool, but is it like a silver bullet for everything? In this session, we have our Agile coach, Maarten Veldhuis, and he's going to discuss his experience and thoughts upon this subject. So it's mostly aimed for project managers and Agile coaches, but I think that if you work with Agile, this session would be really interesting to follow. And then lastly, for this session, I'll also mention another Power BI session, Battle of the Power BI preparation tools. And this session goes about how you have different Power BI features that both ingest and prepare the data. And we're going to like compare those features and see in which case which feature might be more useful. So again, if you work in reporting, or if you're tech lead data, and even like a data engineer, I think this session would be really interesting for you. Here's the link for the Sogeti website, but I will also post a meetup link in the chat below if you want to follow it that way. And then lastly, we also have a Medium page where we have different blogs and articles written. Here you can see an example of one that I've written, but there are really interesting ones on this website. So again, you can have the link also in the chat. And yeah, I would implore you to go ahead and see if there are any interesting articles for you. That leaves it for me. Again, I want to thank Erik for your time and your session. I want to thank you all for coming in and listening to the session. And yeah, all have a good evening.
Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
A nice evening. Thank you.
Fijne avond. Dankjewel.
Thanks for the session, Erik.
Dankjewel, Erik. En Michael.
Ja.